Caligula would lead a life of debauchery and brutally murder for fun. He reveled in killing his victims slowly and painfully over days. Caligula forced families to attend their children's executions. His sadism horrified an empire. Caligula was born in 12 AD, the third son of a celebrated commander from the most powerful family in the Roman Empire. His real name, Gaius Julius Caesar, emphasized his imperial lineage. Caligula's father, Germanicus, was a war hero, posted on the empire's northern frontier. Agrippina, Caligula's mother, was the granddaughter of Emperor Augustus. She was outspoken, proud, and ambitious. To curry favor with the army, Agrippina dressed her son in miniature military uniform. It was the troops who nicknamed him Caligula, meaning little boots. The child grew up amid jealousy and infighting, in a family torn apart by rivalry. Germanicus's fame was a threat to his stepfather, the ruling emperor Tiberius.
The Emperor Tiberius had adopted Germanicus as his heir. Caligula's whole life was to be influenced by the reflected glory of his father. His mother's side was no less auspicious. She was the granddaughter of the Emperor Augustus, whose charismatic leadership had made the concept of one-person rule popular in Rome. The emperor-to-be and his wife were the dream couple and had the world at their feet. Although Caligula was their third son, he could never have predicted he'd become emperor himself. We know Caligula was a sickly child and he was spoilt rotten, but he also seems to have been something of a prodigy.
In May 17 AD, Germanicus was recalled from Germany. It was a glorious return to Rome. Surrounded by prisoners and war booty, Germanicus led a triumphant procession. Riding in his chariot, the boy Caligula lapped up the adulation. But the family had little time to enjoy their glory. 2 years later, Germanicus was dead. His painful death had all the symptoms of poisoning. Rumors circulated that Emperor Tiberius was responsible. Egged on by massive public grief, Agrippina blamed Tiberius for her husband's murder. Agrippina's hostility sealed her fate. The young Caligula watched as Tiberius turned on his family. One by one, his mother and 2 older brothers were arrested. They were condemned as enemies of the state and forced to commit suicide. Agrippina starved herself to death. But Caligula was spared. After his mother's arrest, he lived with his grandmother and great-grandmother, powerful Roman matrons. And at the age of 19, he was summoned unexpectedly to Capri to join Emperor Tiberius. Leaving Rome behind, Tiberius had retired to Capri, far from public scrutiny. The island had grown notorious for debauchery and cruelty. For 6 years, Caligula lived here, forced to pay his respects to the man he held responsible for his family's deaths. He played the perfect guest. Caligula suppressed his thirst for vengeance. But according to his biographer Suetonius, he found plenty to vent his frustration on.
Yet even at that time he was not able to control his savage and reprehensible nature. Indeed, he showed the keenest interest in witnessing the sufferings and torments of those condemned to be tortured.
Caligula made the most of his time on Capri, creating key alliances. He married Junia Claudia, daughter of a distinguished senator. But his most important ally was Macro, head of the Praetorian Guard and a veteran of violence. As Tiberius's right-hand man, Macro had organized the notorious trials and executions of the emperor's reign. The partnership was so strong that Macro allowed Caligula to sleep with his wife. Tiberius watched the alliance in horror, fearful for the future of his own grandson, Gemellus. But his hands were tied. As the son of Germanicus, Caligula already had the people's support. With Macro behind him, he had the army too. Reluctantly, Tiberius named his joint successors. Caligula and Gemellus were to rule together. It would never happen. Tiberius died in March 37. Guided by Macro, the Senate threw out his will on the grounds of insanity. They handed sole control of the empire to Caligula.
History has left us a portrait of Caligula as the archetypal mad tyrant. But when he became emperor at the age of 25, there was no sign that he was unstable. Backed by the Praetorian Guard, and with the gleam of his father's charisma still bright, he literally had the world at his feet. Rome gave him a tumultuous welcoming home ceremony.
In their enthusiasm, the Senate handed Caligula absolute power.
Caligula found himself as the leader of the Roman world.
Caligula and Macro capitalized on the mood of celebration. The Praetorian Guard were handed a cash bonus. The Roman people were treated to theatre and games. The Senate were reassured that Tiberius's hated treason trials would stop. And to their relief, Caligula publicly destroyed papers listing his family's accusers. He promised there would be no prosecutions. No one knew there were copies. The first 6 months of Caligula's reign were a period of euphoria. They came at a price. In just 12 months, Caligula ran through 2.7 billion sesterces, enough to pay the army for 8 years. But the golden days of fun had taken a greater toll on his health. Before the summer was over, he suffered a physical and mental breakdown. Caligula's condition sent shockwaves through Rome.
The last 6 months had been all too much for Caligula. The release from repression, the emotion, the excitement took their toll on the highly strung emperor. In late September, he suffered some sort of breakdown. We don't know whether the illness was mental or physical, but we do know it took him out of circulation, and it marked a turning point for Caligula. For 3 months, it was touch and go. As news filtered down from his palace on the Palatine, the empire held its breath.
For the rest of his life, Caligula suffered headaches and sleepless nights, pacing his palace till daylight. But it was Rome that suffered most. Caligula demanded a terrifying show of loyalty.
The man who had promised he would fight as a gladiator, he obliged to fulfill his vow, looking on as he struggled in combat and not letting him off until he had won his fight and pleaded repeatedly for delivery.
Caligula lashed out at close relatives and friends as he regained his strength. Gemellus, Tiberius's grandson, was accused of hoping for the emperor's death. The 18-year-old was shown how to kill himself. Caligula turned on his father-in-law, Silanus. The old man was accused of treason. Even Macro fell foul of the emperor's anger and mistrust. Caligula had grown resentful of his mentor's advice. He charged Macro with prostituting his wife. Both committed suicide. Ennia had been Caligula's mistress. Now Macro had gone, no one would hold Caligula back. At the age of 24, Caligula had been handed the reins of power. He had removed immediate threats to his position and thrown himself into an orgy of pleasure. He spent vast amounts on sports and games.
Caligula came to believe that he could use his power to indulge his own pleasures and his own whims, and that he could do anything to anybody. He didn't realize that if you want to stay in power, you actually have to control your emotions and your desires.
Caligula built his own racing track and poisoned his rivals' horses. He joked he would appoint his favorite horse to the Senate, since it was as clever as any senator.
This was an intelligent man and a witty one, very well able to deal with words. The stories about him are sometimes quite amusing if they didn't have victims.
Caligula also had a passion for gladiators. He ordered more bloodthirsty spectacles, and to the horror of the Senate, he even joined in, killing a gladiator in a mock fight.
Once, when he and a Murmillo from the gladiatorial school had been having a fight with wooden swords and the latter deliberately fell to the ground, he ran the man through with a real dagger.
1 year into his reign, Caligula was showing a mania for self-indulgence. Guests to his dinner parties were presented with food made of gold, while the emperor drank pearls dissolved in vinegar. His sexual appetite has gained lasting notoriety. Caligula demanded sex from prisoners, senators, and members of his family.
He habitually indulged in incestuous relations with all his sisters, and at a crowded banquet he would make them take turns in lying beneath him, while his wife lay above.
When Drusilla, his favorite sister, died in 38 AD, Caligula declared her a goddess. He placed her statue in the Temple of Venus, goddess of love. Caligula was obsessed by women he could not have. Less than 2 years after his ecstatic reception, the emperor's behavior was causing alarm in the Senate. By early AD 39, there were stirrings of resistance. Caligula's response was to unleash terror. Marching into the Senate, he branded them hypocrites who turned against Tiberius and would turn against him. Now he revealed he'd kept copies of lists of his family's enemies, despite his promise. There was panic as he accused everyone of involvement in his family's deaths.
Caligula's attitude towards the Senate was one of complete contempt. Now the gloves are completely off. The facade of a Roman emperor who takes advice and listens to his Senate is well and truly over.
Terrified, the Senate agreed to a resumption of the treason trials. Caligula's purge was indiscriminate. Throughout his reign, the emperor took a keen interest in inflicting death. He issued precise instructions. Prisoners should be killed slowly by a series of small cuts. Executioners were told victims must feel their deaths. The emperor was often present, even dining during the ordeal. He also insisted the victims' families join him. One father pleaded that he was too ill to attend. Caligula sent a litter to his house to collect him. As Caligula indulged his sadism to the hilt, members of the Senate even found themselves ordered into the gladiators' ring. Unlike his father Germanicus, Caligula was no soldier, but he believed he could exceed Germanicus's reputation and extend the empire into Britain. Caligula marched in comfort, accompanied by his troops and gladiators, crossing the German border early in 40 AD. After minor skirmishes, he fled in panic from an enemy attack. Now he switched his attention to Britain. What happened next defies military logic. On reaching the English Channel, Caligula set out to sea. But, as his biographer Dio reports, he promptly returned to shore.
He took his seat on a lofty platform and gave the soldiers the signal as if for battle, bidding the trumpeters urge them on. Then, all of a sudden, he ordered them to gather up the shells.
Caligula's elite forces picked up shells in their helmets. They were sent back to Rome for display as the spoils of victory over the ocean.
So what was going on? Again, academics have put forward several plausible explanations for what appear to be Caligula's random actions. Some think the very act of bringing the soldiers to the seashore was enough to quell a rebellion, and the seashells are a purely symbolic booty of war. Others think that Caligula was forced to abandon his plans because the soldiers refused to cross the channel.
His behavior remains a mystery. Certainly, his dreams of conquest had come to nothing. On returning to Rome, he tested the Senate's loyalty to the utmost, demanding they treat him as a god. Earlier emperors had been worshipped after death. Caligula was not prepared to wait. Caligula had received dramatic proof that he was not divine. As he returned from the theatre on the 24th of January 41 AD, Caligula was stabbed to death. The assassins included members of his family and the Praetorian Guard assigned to protect him.
Caligula was killed because there was no other way to get rid of him, and no apparent end to the evils he was prepared to perpetrate.
First-century biographer Suetonius.
Caligula lay writhing on the ground. "I am still alive," he shouted. But word went round, "Strike again," and he succumbed to 30 further wounds.
It was a really crucial moment that revealed the military underpinnings of an emperor's power for the first time in a very raw and obvious fashion.
The Praetorians will choose their own man as the new emperor. Behind a curtain, they find their candidate cowering, Caligula's uncle Claudius. Here is someone who will be easy to control, a puppet to be manipulated.
He drooled, he stammered, he twitched. Perhaps the only reason he survived was simply because nobody took him seriously. Nobody saw him as a possible candidate.
Confident in their choice, the Guard proclaims Claudius leader of the greatest empire on earth.